If we freeze the trust today, the deal collapses in 24 hours, my attorney said, his voice calm and measured across the polished oak desk. And I remember thinking how strange it was that a single click could undo what my own son had tried to set in motion without me. I nodded once and told him to proceed. But this story didn't begin in that office. It began 3 nights earlier, when my phone buzzed at 9:17 p.m. and Daniel's name lit up the screen. I let it go to voicemail. He rarely called that late unless Emily was out with friends or something had gone wrong with one of the grandkids' soccer schedules. I pressed play while standing alone in my kitchen, the overhead light humming softly above me. "Mom," he said, and there was a pause, the kind that doesn't belong in a loving conversation. "Maybe it's better if you don't come back for a while." In the background, I could hear the faint scrape of a chair and what sounded like Emily whispering something I couldn't quite make out. The message ended there. No explanation, no warmth, just a suggestion that felt more like an instruction. I stood very still, the refrigerator cycling on behind me, and replayed it. Then I played it again. I didn't cry. At 71, you learn that tears rarely clarify anything. Instead, I set my phone down beside the sugar bowl and looked around the house my late husband and I had paid off inch by inch over 30 years. The hardwood floors Daniel learned to walk on. The bay window where he once built lopsided science fair projects. 2 weeks earlier, I had driven upstate to stay with a friend after Daniel insisted I take a break, while he and Emily handled the listing of our lake house. I had agreed because I trusted him. I had created the family trust myself after Charles passed, wanting everything organized, protected, and simple. Daniel was named co-trustee with me, a practical decision at the time. That night, though, something in his voice felt rehearsed, almost relieved. The next morning, instead of calling him back, I opened my laptop at the small desk in my bedroom and logged into the trust portal. I don't consider myself overly suspicious, but I do believe in verifying what concerns me. The dashboard loaded slowly. Distributions pending. Asset reallocation in review. And then a line that made my breath pause just slightly. Amendment filed, beneficiary adjustment temporary pending sale. I didn't remember filing any amendment. I certainly hadn't authorized any temporary adjustment. My coffee sat untouched beside me, steam fading into the air. I checked the house listing next. The lake property had been on the market for 3 weeks, and Daniel assured me we were simply testing interest. But according to the real estate site, it was under contract. Closing scheduled in 48 hours. Escrow active. I leaned back in my chair and folded my hands in my lap. Under contract meant signatures. It meant paperwork. It meant decisions had been made. I thought back to a dinner last month when Emily had smiled too brightly and said, "It's time to let go of things that tie you down, Margaret." At the time, I assumed she meant the boat, or perhaps the old dock that needed replacing. Now I wondered if she meant something else entirely. I replayed the voicemail one more time, listening not just to Daniel's words, but to what sat behind them. Don't come back. Not until when? Not until the sale closed. Not until my name was less important on a document I created. I closed the laptop gently, as if the motion itself required dignity. I wasn't angry. Not yet. I was attentive. And sometimes, that is far more powerful. I did not call Daniel that morning. Instead, I drove to the bank branch on Maple Avenue, the same red brick building where Charles and I had opened our first joint account 38 years ago with a $500 deposit and more hope than sense. The parking lot was nearly empty, just a pickup truck and a silver sedan glinting under the pale sun. I sat in my car for a moment before going in, listening to the faint ticking of the cooling engine and thinking about how easily a lifetime of careful planning can be rearranged by someone who assumes you are no longer paying attention. Inside, the air smelled faintly of carpet cleaner and paper. A young teller smiled and asked how she could help me. I asked to speak with a trust officer. My voice sounded steady, even to me. While I waited, I studied the framed photographs on the wall, local families smiling at ribbon cuttings and scholarship ceremonies, all of them built on the quiet promise that signatures mean something. When Mr. Harris came out to greet me, he recognized my name immediately. The Whitmore Family Trust had been on file there for years. We sat in a small glass office, and I folded my hands on the desk just as I had done the night before at home. I explained that I wanted a full activity report for the past 60 days and immediate confirmation of any pending distributions or amendments. He typed carefully, the keys clicking in a measured rhythm. After a minute, he cleared his throat. There had been a request submitted electronically to adjust the distribution schedule tied to the anticipated proceeds of the lake house sale. The adjustment would temporarily consolidate authority under the co-trustee for transactional efficiency. Transactional efficiency. I almost smiled at how gentle that phrase sounded. I asked who had initiated the request. The system showed it had been submitted through Daniel's Secure Access. There was a digital acknowledgement under my name as well, timestamped at 11:42 p.m. 3 nights ago. At that exact time, I had been asleep in my friend Carol's guest room with a paperback novel resting on my chest. I did not say that aloud. Instead, I asked whether such acknowledgement could be reversed prior to closing. Mr. Harris explained that as primary grantor, I retained the right to suspend distributions and place a temporary hold on asset movement pending review. It would require my written instruction. I nodded slowly, absorbing each word. Outside the glass wall, I could see the teller assisting an elderly man with a coin jar, patient and unhurried. Life going on as usual. I thought about the voicemail again. Did not come back for a while. I wondered if Daniel believed that distance made authority easier to shift. I wondered if Emily had stood beside him as he logged into the portal, guiding his cursor across decisions that were never hers to make. I asked Mr. Harris one more question. Had escrow funds already been allocated in anticipation of the sale? He checked again. A preliminary transfer was scheduled for the morning after closing, contingent on clear title and trust authorization. Clear title, trust authorization, two pillars resting on my signature. I thanked him for his time and requested copies of everything. As the printer hummed, I felt something inside me settle into place, not anger, not even disappointment, but clarity. The kind that arrives when pieces that once seemed unrelated suddenly align. When I stepped back into the sunlight, the air felt sharper against my skin. I did not call Daniel then either. I drove back to Carol's house, placed the folder neatly on the dining table, and read each page line by line. I was not being pushed aside. I was being maneuvered. And maneuvering, I have learned, can be answered without raising your voice. That evening, I spread the documents across Carol's dining table as if they were pieces of a quiet puzzle, each page carrying more meaning than the last. The trust amendment request had been submitted at 11:42 at night, a time Daniel knew I would never be reviewing financial portals. The digital acknowledgement under my name did not include biometric verification, only a secondary password I had shared with him years ago when Charles was in the hospital and we believed in preparing for emergencies together. I traced the timestamp with the tip of my finger and tried to remember when trust had shifted from partnership to convenience. The next morning, exactly 36 hours before closing, I called our family attorney, Robert Gaines. He had drafted the original trust 5 years ago and had attended Charles's memorial service. When he answered, I could hear traffic in the background, the distant hum of a highway. I asked him one question. Could a co-trustee reassign temporary distribution authority without my physical signature present? There was a pause on the line, not long, but long enough to suggest concern. He explained that while digital systems allowed for efficiency, ultimate control remained with the grantor, and any action taken under questionable authorization could be suspended pending review. I thanked him and asked him to email me a formal notice template to freeze distributions and halt any asset transfer connected to the pending real estate transaction. He did not ask why. He simply said he would send it within the hour. After we hung up, I sat back and allowed myself to think about the lake house. It sat 2 hours north, overlooking still water that turned silver at sunset. Daniel had learned to fish from that dock, tangling his line and laughing when Charles pretended to scold him. It was never just property. It was memory converted into square footage. When Emily first suggested selling it, she framed it as relief for me. Fewer stairs, less maintenance, no long drives. She said it gently, with that polished smile that rarely reached her eyes. I had not objected because I believed the proceeds would remain within the trust, preserved for stability, not redistributed for convenience. 24 hours before closing, I drove back to my own house. I used my spare key. The entryway smelled faintly of lemon cleaner, a scent Emily preferred. The framed family photographs on the console table had been rearranged. A newer picture of Daniel and Emily at a charity gala stood where a photograph of Charles and me used to be. I did not move it back. I walked to the study and opened the desk drawer where I kept the original trust binder. The pages inside were exactly as I had left them, thick cream paper with Robert's embossed seal. I compared them line by line to the digital amendment printed from the portal. The language about temporary consolidation of authority was precise, almost elegant. It spoke of efficiency and streamlined execution. It did not speak of exclusion. Late that afternoon, Daniel called. I let it ring twice before answering. His voice sounded tight, controlled. He asked whether I had spoken to the bank. I told him I had reviewed the documents carefully. There was a brief silence, the kind that fills a room, even through a telephone. He said Emily had only been trying to simplify things. I responded that simplicity should never require secrecy. He exhaled softly, as if weighing his next words. I did not raise my voice. I did not accuse. I simply informed him that I would be meeting with Robert the following morning before any closing occurred. When we ended the call, I placed the phone face down on the desk and looked out the study window at the maple tree Charles planted the year Daniel turned 10. The leaves were beginning to change, a quiet shift that happens whether anyone notices or not. Some transitions are natural, others are arranged, and I was beginning to understand which one this was. The next morning, with less than 24 hours before the scheduled closing, I met Robert Gaines at his office downtown. His building overlooked the courthouse square, a place Charles and I had once visited to file paperwork for our first small business. I remember how proud we felt signing those documents together, believing that structure was the backbone of security. Robert greeted me with the same steady handshake he had offered at Charles's memorial service, his expression respectful but alert. I handed him the printed amendment and the activity report from the bank without commentary. He adjusted his glasses and read slowly, his eyes moving line by line, occasionally underlining phrases with a pencil. When he finished, he leaned back and folded his hands. He explained that while the language used in the amendment appeared procedural, the timing and method of authorization raised legitimate concerns. Any consolidation of authority that reduced my direct oversight, even temporarily, required clear consent beyond a simple password entry. He asked whether I had personally initiated the change. I answered no. He did not look surprised. Instead, he reached for a legal pad and began drafting a notice of suspension, formally freezing all trust distributions and instructing the escrow agent to halt any transfer of proceeds until authorization could be verified. The words he wrote were calm and precise. There was no accusation in them, only protection. As he worked, I watched sunlight slide across the hardwood floor of his office, thinking about how quietly major shifts in a family can unfold. No shouting, no dramatic confrontations, just a series of small decisions made under the assumption that the oldest voice in the room will not object. When the document was ready, he slid it toward me. I read every sentence carefully. It stated that as grantor and primary trustee, I was exercising my right to suspend asset movement pending investigation into unauthorized amendments. It directed the bank and the real estate escrow company to cease processing until further notice. I signed my name slowly, the ink pressing firmly into the paper. My signature looked steady. Afterward, Robert said he would personally send certified copies to the bank and the escrow office within the hour. He also recommended updating access credentials and temporarily revoking co-trustee transactional privileges until matters were clarified. I agreed. We scheduled a follow-up meeting for the following week to review the structure of the trust entirely. When I stepped outside onto the courthouse square, the air felt cooler than the day before. I checked my phone. 3 missed calls from Daniel. 1 voicemail. I did not listen to it immediately. Instead, I walked to a nearby cafe and ordered tea. I sat by the window and watched people pass. Young couples pushing strollers, a man walking a golden retriever, 2 teenagers laughing over something on a shared screen. Life moved forward in steady increments. After a few minutes, my phone vibrated again. Daniel's name appeared once more. This time, I answered. His voice carried an edge I had not heard before, a mixture of urgency and disbelief. He asked whether I had instructed the bank to freeze the trust. I told him I had suspended distributions pending clarification. He said the escrow officer had just informed him the sale could not proceed without my authorization. I replied that authorization required transparency. There was a pause, longer this time. I could almost hear Emily in the background, her tone sharp but indistinct. Daniel said they were only trying to streamline the process and that I was overreacting. I told him I was not reacting. I was verifying. Silence settled between us. I ended the call gently, without anger, and placed my phone on the cafe table beside my teacup. The lake house still stood where it had always stood. The trust still bore the name Charles and I chose together. And for the first time since the voicemail, I felt the balance shift back into my hands. By late afternoon, the calls stopped and the messages began. My phone lit up on the kitchen counter as I stood at the sink rinsing a teacup I had not actually used. The house felt unusually quiet, as if even the walls were waiting to see what would happen next. I dried my hands carefully before pressing play on Daniel's voicemail. His voice was strained, but no longer controlled. He said the buyers were threatening to walk away. He said the escrow officer needed clarification immediately. He said Emily was embarrassed because they had already discussed renovation plans for a new property. Renovation plans. The phrase hung in the air long after the recording ended. I walked into the living room and sat in Charles's old armchair, the one with the slightly worn leather on the left armrest where his watch used to rest. I remembered a Sunday afternoon years ago when Daniel was 14 and wanted to borrow the car for the first time. Charles had made him sit down and explain not just where he was going, but why it mattered. Responsibility, he told him, is not about access. It is about accountability. That lesson seemed to have faded somewhere between college tuition checks and wedding deposits. An hour later, Daniel appeared at my front door. He did not use his key. He knocked. I opened it slowly. He looked tired, the way men do when they realize something has shifted beyond their control. Emily stood a few feet behind him on the walkway, arms folded tightly across her chest, her posture rigid but her expression polished. I stepped aside and allowed them in. No one raised their voice. Daniel began explaining that the amendment was meant to simplify distribution once the lake house funds cleared. He said it was temporary. He said I was still protected. I listened without interrupting. Emily added that real estate markets move quickly and that decisive action was necessary. She spoke as if presenting a business proposal rather than discussing a home filled with memory. I asked one question. Why was I asked not to return? Daniel hesitated. He said they thought it would be easier to manage logistics without added stress. I nodded slowly. Stress. An interesting word to assign to the person who created the trust. I walked to the console table and picked up the photograph of Charles and me that had been moved aside. I held it in my hands for a moment before placing it back in its original position. Then I turned to Daniel and explained that I had suspended the trust distributions pending review because authorization requires clarity. I said the sale would not proceed until every amendment was properly evaluated and access credentials were secured. Emily's composure flickered, just slightly. She asked whether I realized how much inconvenience this would cause. I told her inconvenience is temporary. Irreversibility is not. The room grew quiet. Daniel looked from me to her and back again, as if measuring which version of stability he preferred. I could see the weight of expectation pressing against him. I softened my tone, but not my position. I reminded him that the trust was established to preserve, not to accelerate. That Charles and I had built it with intention. He said he never meant to exclude me. I believed that in a way. Intent is not always aligned with outcome. After a few minutes, they left, the door closing gently behind them. I stood in the hallway listening to the faint echo of their footsteps fading down the driveway. Outside, the sky was turning a muted shade of blue-gray, the kind that signals a change in season. Inside, the documents remained on the dining table, orderly and intact. The lake house still belonged to the trust. The trust still answered to me. And for the first time since that late-night voicemail, there was no uncertainty about who would decide what happened next. The next morning arrived without drama, which felt almost ironic considering how close everything had come to shifting beyond my reach. I woke before sunrise and lay still for a few minutes, listening to the steady hum of the heating system and the faint chirping of birds outside the bedroom window. There is something clarifying about early light. It does not argue. It simply reveals what is already there. I dressed carefully, choosing a navy sweater and pressed slacks, the kind of outfit that feels composed without trying too hard. At 9 o'clock, my phone rang. It was the escrow officer. Her tone was professional, almost cautious. She confirmed receipt of the suspension notice and explained that the buyers had been informed the closing would not proceed as scheduled. Earnest money would remain in escrow pending further instruction. She asked whether I anticipated lifting the hold soon. I told her I anticipated reviewing the trust structure thoroughly before making any decision. She thanked me and ended the call. A few minutes later, another call came, this time from Daniel. I let it ring once before answering. He sounded exhausted, as though he had not slept. He said the buyers were upset and that the real estate agent was pressuring him for answers. I listened quietly. He said Emily felt blindsided. I paused before responding, choosing my words carefully. I told him that being blindsided requires surprise, and surprise requires absence of information. I had not been informed about the amendment or the closing timeline. Silence followed, heavier than before. He admitted they should have handled it differently. I appreciated that he said should instead of could. There is a difference between possibility and responsibility. After we ended the call, I drove back to the bank to complete what Robert had recommended. I updated every access credential associated with the trust, selecting passwords no one else could guess, and enabling additional verification measures that required my direct confirmation for any transaction above $5,000. The trust officer walked me through the settings patiently. Each click felt deliberate, not reactionary but corrective. On my way home, I stopped at the hardware store and bought a small fireproof lockbox. Not because I feared theft, but because I valued order. That afternoon, I placed the original trust binder, recent activity reports, and Robert's suspension notice inside it. I set the box on the top shelf of my closet, above the winter coats Charles once wore. Later, Daniel texted asking if we could talk in person again, this time without Emily. I agreed to meet him the following day at a coffee shop halfway between our homes. I did not interpret the request as rebellion against his wife. I interpreted it as a sign that he was beginning to separate influence from intention. That evening, I cooked a simple dinner for myself, grilled chicken and steamed vegetables, nothing elaborate. I set one plate at the table and sat down without rushing. Across the room, the photograph of Charles and me rested where I had placed it back on the console. I looked at it and thought about the promises we made quietly, not just to each other, but to the structure of our life. Security was never about control. It was about clarity. And clarity, I was beginning to understand, is something you must protect even from the people you love. Outside, the wind moved gently through the maple tree, carrying away the last few leaves that had loosened overnight. Some changes arrive without permission. Others require a firm hand. And for now, that hand was mine. The coffee shop sat between our neighborhoods, neutral ground with small round tables, and the steady hiss of an espresso machine in the background. I arrived 10 minutes early and chose a seat near the window. Outside, traffic moved in slow waves, headlights blinking as drivers adjusted to the late afternoon sun. When Daniel walked in, he looked older than he had a week ago. Not physically older, but heavier somehow, as if the space between his shoulders had narrowed under invisible pressure. He ordered black coffee and joined me without touching the pastry. Display he usually could not resist. For a moment, we sat in silence. I let him begin. He said he wanted to explain without interruption, and I nodded. He admitted that the idea to consolidate authority over the trust proceeds had been discussed several times at home. Emily believed that once the lake house sold, they could leverage the liquidity to secure a larger property closer to the city, one that would appreciate faster and position them more comfortably among her colleagues. He said they convinced themselves it was still within the spirit of the trust because the funds technically remained in family hands. I listened carefully. He did not mention the voicemail until I asked about it directly. He lowered his eyes and said that the night he left that message, they had just come from a meeting with the real estate agent who warned that buyers might hesitate if the seller appeared uncertain. He thought distance would prevent complications. I asked him whether I had ever complicated a decision in his life without reason. He shook his head slowly. I reminded him that transparency is not an obstacle. It is protection. He sighed and admitted he had allowed urgency to override judgment. I appreciated that word. Judgment. It suggested awareness rather than excuse. I told him I had no objection to strategic investments. I objected to being removed from the decision-making structure I created. He nodded again, more firmly this time. I could see the conflict in him, loyalty divided between spouse and parent, between immediate ambition and long-term stability. I did not ask him to choose. Instead, I explained that I would be restructuring the trust to require joint authorization for any amendment affecting beneficiary allocation and that certain assets, including the lake house, would remain protected under non-liquidating clauses unless I personally approved otherwise. He looked surprised, perhaps because he had not expected me to move beyond suspension into revision. I told him revision is not punishment. It is correction. He asked whether the sale could still happen eventually. I answered that possibility remains open, but not under pressure and not without full documentation reviewed in person. He stared into his coffee cup for a long moment before saying he understood. When we stood to leave, he placed his hand briefly on my shoulder, a gesture that felt more like a son seeking reassurance than a man negotiating assets. Outside, the air carried the faint scent of rain, though the sky remained clear. As I watched him walk to his car, I realized something quiet but important had shifted. The trust was no longer just a legal instrument. It had become a boundary. And boundaries, when set calmly and clearly, do not break families. They reveal them. 2 days after our meeting at the coffee shop, the buyers formally withdrew. The real estate agent left a polite voicemail explaining that uncertainty around authorization made them uncomfortable proceeding. There was no anger in her tone, only professionalism. I listened to the message while standing at the kitchen counter, then deleted it without replaying it. The lake house remained unsold. The escrow funds stayed where they belonged. That afternoon, Emily called for the first time since the suspension. Her voice was controlled, almost overly composed. She said she wanted to clear the air. I agreed to meet her at my home. When she arrived, she wore the same structured blazer she favored for work meetings, as if we were negotiating a contract rather than discussing family. She sat on the edge of the sofa, hands clasped tightly in her lap. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she said she had never intended to exclude me. She said she believed I was overwhelmed and that taking temporary control of the transaction would reduce stress. I listened without interrupting. She continued, explaining that in her experience, decisive leadership requires minimizing variables. I asked her whether she considered me a variable. The question seemed to catch her off guard. She hesitated before saying she considered me protected. I nodded slowly. Protection without participation can feel like displacement. She looked down at her hands. I told her I understood ambition. I understood wanting to build something larger and faster. What I did not understand was why transparency felt inconvenient. She said they feared I would hesitate, and that hesitation might cost them leverage in the market. I replied that hesitation is often wisdom wearing patience. The room fell quiet. Outside, the maple tree moved gently in the breeze, leaves brushing against the window glass. I explained that the trust had been created not only to preserve assets, but to preserve relationships by removing ambiguity. When amendments are made quietly, ambiguity returns. She took a slow breath and admitted they should have discussed every step openly. I believed she meant it, though sincerity does not erase consequence. I told her the trust would remain suspended until new safeguards were implemented, including dual authentication and in-person authorization for any structural change. I also informed her that the lake house would not be listed again until I decided it was time, not when market pressure suggested urgency. Her posture softened slightly. She asked whether this meant I no longer trusted them. I answered that trust is not a fixed object. It adjusts based on behavior. For now, structure would replace assumption. When she left, the house felt still but not tense. That evening, Daniel called to say he supported the revisions. He sounded calmer than before, as though clarity had replaced panic. I thanked him and told him I would send both of them a copy of the updated provisions once Robert finalized the language. After the call, I walked into the study and opened the lockbox. I reviewed the documents one more time, not because I doubted them, but because I respected them. The trust was intact. The property remained in our name. And the quiet space between words, the space where decisions are often made, now belonged to me again. 1 week after the buyers withdrew, I returned to the lake house alone. The drive north felt familiar, 2 hours of open highway and quiet radio static that I eventually turned off. I wanted to hear the road. When I pulled into the gravel driveway, the place looked exactly as it always had. White siding catching the late morning sun, the dock stretching calmly into still water. Nothing about it suggested urgency. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside. The air carried the faint scent of cedar and old books. I walked room to room slowly, not searching for anything, simply confirming presence. In the living room, The woven blanket Charles favored still rested over the back of the sofa. In the kitchen, the ceramic bowl Daniel painted in third grade remained on the shelf, uneven glaze and all. I stood at the window overlooking the lake and allowed myself a long breath. Property can be sold. Memory cannot. Later that afternoon, I called Robert from the porch and confirmed the final revisions to the trust. The updated structure required joint trustee authorization for any amendment, affecting asset allocation, mandatory in-person verification for beneficiary changes, and a non-liquidation clause protecting the lake house unless I personally initiated a sale. I also reassigned successor trustee provisions to include an independent fiduciary should any dispute arise. Structure does not signal distrust. It signals maturity. When I ended the call, I sat in one of the wooden chairs Charles built years ago and watched sunlight ripple across the water. My phone buzzed. A message from Daniel. He asked how the lake looked. I told him it was steady. He replied that he and Emily would like to visit soon, without discussing real estate. I read that line twice. Without discussing real estate. I responded that they were welcome next Sunday for lunch. Simple words. Clear boundaries. That evening, before driving back home, I locked the house carefully and paused at the dock. The boards creaked softly under my shoes, a familiar sound that had once accompanied fishing lines and childhood laughter. I did not feel triumphant. I felt settled. The following week, Daniel and Emily arrived at my house on time. Emily carried a homemade pie. Daniel hugged me a little longer than usual. We sat at the dining table where documents had once been spread in quiet defense, and this time we spoke about ordinary things. Work schedules, the grandchildren's school projects, weather forecasts predicting early frost. The trust was not mentioned. It did not need to be. Boundaries, once drawn, do not require constant explanation. As they prepared to leave, Daniel paused near the door and said he appreciated my patience. I told him patience and clarity are not opposites. They are partners. After they drove away, I walked back into the living room and looked at the photograph of Charles and me on the console table. I did not need to move it this time. It remained exactly where it belonged. I thought about the voicemail that had begun this chain of events and how easily silence can be misinterpreted as weakness. Silence is not surrender. Sometimes it is strategy. I had not shouted. I had not accused. I had simply ensured that what we built remained intact. And in doing so, I had preserved more than property. I had preserved my place within it.